1981, a man sat quietly in a room in Howard Beach, Queens, and gave an order that would cost another man his life. There was no shouting, no argument, just a decision, delivered in the same tone one might use to cancel a dinner reservation. The man giving the order was Joseph Charles Massino. The man who would die was Sonny Black Napolitano, a trusted captain in the Bonanno crime family, a man who had made the single worst mistake a mafioso could make. He had let an FBI agent into the family. Sonny Black was taken to a house on Staten Island. He was led down to the basement. He knew what was about to happen. According to those present, his final words were simple. He said, "If you are going to do it, make it good." They shot him several times. His hands were later found severed, a message to anyone who might consider a similar lapse in judgment. But the killing of Sonny Black did not solve the problem. The problem was already inside the walls, buried in hundreds of hours of surveillance notes, testimony, and recorded conversations. The problem had a name the public would come to know: Donnie Brasco, and the man who would spend the next 2 decades trying to recover from that problem, and who would ultimately destroy everything he built in the process of saving himself, was Joe Massino. That moment in 1981 was not the beginning of Joe Massino's story, but it defined everything that would follow. Trust no one fully, punish failure absolutely, never allow sentiment to interfere with survival. To understand how Massino came to control one of New York's 5 mafia families, you have to understand what he inherited. The Bonanno family was not like the others. It was smaller, more insular, and operated under a culture of secrecy that bordered on paranoia. Founded in the early 20th century by Sicilian immigrants who brought with them the traditions and hierarchies of the old country. The family took its name from Joseph Bonanno, who led the organization for decades. New York's 5 families each controlled their own territory and rackets, governed loosely by a body known as the Commission, which settled disputes and enforced the rules. At the top of those rules was Omerta, the code of silence. Break it, and you died. The Bonannos took this code more seriously than most. But by the late 1970s, the family was in turmoil. Internal power struggles had weakened its leadership. Factions fought for control. And into this vacuum stepped Joe Massino, a man who had risen through the ranks not through flash or public spectacle, but through discipline and calculation. Massino was born in 1943 in Maspeth, Queens, the son of working-class Italian-American parents. He grew up in a neighborhood where organized crime was woven into daily life, visible in the men who ran the social clubs, the businesses that paid protection, and the quiet arrangements that had nothing to do with the law. He entered the life early. By his 20s, he was associated with the Bonanno family, working his way up through a combination of criminal enterprise and personal relationships. He was not flamboyant. He was methodical and patient. And the men who lasted longest in his world were the ones who made the fewest mistakes. He proved himself capable of both earning money and enforcing discipline, the 2 qualities that mattered above all else. He built relationships with key figures in the organization. When problems arose, he solved them quietly. When violence was required, he did not hesitate. By the early 1980s, Massino had positioned himself as the de facto leader of the Bonanno family. But the family he inherited was damaged in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. The Donnie Brasco operation had done what no law enforcement effort had done before. It had placed an undercover FBI agent, Joseph Pistone, inside the family for 6 extraordinary years. The scope and duration of the infiltration were without precedent in the history of American law enforcement. Pistone, operating under the alias Donnie Brasco, had posed as a small-time jewel thief and con artist working the fringes of organized crime. He frequented the bars and social clubs where low-level mafia associates gathered, and he carefully, patiently built a reputation as a reliable earner who could be trusted with increasingly sensitive tasks. Over time, he was introduced to higher-ranking members of the family. He attended meetings where criminal activities were discussed openly. He participated in operations. He witnessed the internal dynamics of the organization, its feuds, its alliances, its rituals, and its violence. And through it all, he was transmitting everything he learned back to his handlers at the FBI. The man who brought him closest to the inner circle was Sonny Black Napolitano, a captain with a reputation for toughness and ambition. Napolitano had taken Pistone under his wing, trusted him with sensitive information, and even recommended him for induction as a made member of the family. Had Pistone's cover not been pulled when it was, he might have become the first and only federal agent ever formally initiated into the American Mafia. When Pistone's true identity was finally revealed, the damage was catastrophic. Massino understood immediately that the infiltration was an existential threat. Pistone's intelligence led to scores of indictments, prosecutions, and convictions, not only within the Bonanno family, but across all 5 families. Approximately 50 mobsters were indicted based on information Pistone had gathered during his 6 years inside. The Bonanno family, which had built its identity on being impenetrable, had proven to be anything but. Massino's response was swift and brutal. Sonny Black was killed. Then Anthony Mira, the man who had first introduced Pistone to Napolitano, was also murdered. To make the message unmistakable, Massino ordered Mira's execution to be carried out by his own cousin. But the executions did not undo the damage. Massino himself was convicted on racketeering charges connected to the Brasco affair and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The Bonanno family was in ruins. The other 4 families, furious at the security breach, treated the Bonannos as radioactive. The Mafia Commission voted to expel the Bonanno family from all syndicated rackets, cutting them off from the shared criminal enterprises that generated millions of dollars annually. The Bonannos were pariahs. No one in the wider Mafia world wanted anything to do with them. For the FBI, the destruction of the Bonanno family was considered a major victory. The Bureau shut down its dedicated Bonanno squad and reassigned agents to the other 4 families. Joe Massino was behind bars. His top men were serving lengthy sentences. His organization was in shambles. As far as law enforcement was concerned, there was nothing left to investigate. This assumption proved to be one of the most significant miscalculations in the history of organized crime enforcement. Even from inside a federal prison, Joe Massino had no intention of surrendering. He had lost a battle, not a war, and he immediately began planning for the next phase. He chose one man to represent him on the outside, one man to carry out his directives and keep the organization alive until he could return to lead it personally. His brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale. Massino and Vitale had grown up together. They were bound by blood, by marriage, and by years of shared criminal activity. Massino trusted Vitale more than he trusted anyone else in the world, and that trust, for a time, was well placed. Vitale visited Massino regularly in prison. What appeared to be routine family visits were in reality operational meetings. Massino issued directives. Vitale carried them out. Slowly, methodically, the Bonanno family began to rebuild. Cut off from the Commission's syndicated rackets, the family had to find new revenue streams. They turned increasingly to narcotics trafficking, which had always existed within certain Bonanno crews, but now became a more central part of the family's income. As drug use surged across the United States in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the market expanded, and the Bonannos capitalized. Their drug operations became a multi-million-dollar business. And all of this happened while the FBI was looking the other way. When Joe Massino was released from prison in November 1992, he stepped back into a world that had changed dramatically. The other 4 families were reeling from their own legal problems. The Commission trials, which prosecuted the bosses of the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families for their participation in vast syndicated criminal enterprises, had resulted in lengthy prison sentences for nearly every significant leader. The convictions had been built on evidence gathered over years of wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperating witnesses. They represented the most comprehensive law enforcement assault on the Mafia in American history. And yet, the Bonanno family had been untouched by them. The irony was remarkable and almost absurd in its completeness. The Donnie Brasco disaster, which had nearly destroyed the Bonanno family, had also inadvertently shielded it from the even more devastating prosecutions that followed. Because the Bonannos had been expelled from the Commission's rackets as punishment for the Brasco infiltration, they were not included in the Commission trial indictments. The government prosecuted the families that were participating in the syndicated rackets. The Bonannos were not participating. Therefore, the Bonannos were not prosecuted. The spotlight that had burned them so badly in the early 80s had moved on, and in its absence, while the FBI focused its resources on the other families, Massino and Vitale had quietly, patiently rebuilt. The organization that Massino returned to was not the shattered remnant he had left behind. It was a functioning, profitable criminal enterprise with established drug networks, gambling operations, and extortion rackets. Massino was now the last major boss standing in New York. The leaders of the other 4 families were in prison or under indictment. Their organizations were in disarray, their command structures disrupted, their ranks thinned by cooperators and convictions. The FBI gave Massino a nickname that reflected this new reality. They called him the Last Don. Massino's organization was, by the mid-1990s, arguably the most powerful of the 5 families. Under his leadership, the Bonannos had gone from outcasts to the dominant force in New York organized crime, and Massino had achieved this through a system of control that was as sophisticated as it was ruthless. He understood, better than perhaps any boss before him, that the Mafia's greatest vulnerability was not law enforcement firepower, it was loose talk. Every major prosecution in Mafia history had been built on the same foundation. Someone talked. Massino was determined that this would not happen to him. He built what law enforcement later described as walls of insulation around himself. The structure Massino imposed on the Bonanno family was designed from the ground up to prevent the kind of penetration that Donnie Brasco had achieved. For decades, the social clubs of New York had served as the Mafia's unofficial offices. They were where business was discussed, disputes were settled, and orders were given. They were also, from a law enforcement perspective, gold mines. An agent parked across the street with a camera could, over the course of weeks, document every member and associate who walked through the door. Organizational charts could be constructed simply by watching who visited whom, and how often, and for how long. Massino abolished the social clubs entirely. He saw them not as tradition, but as liability. Every gathering point was a potential surveillance target. Every recurring meeting was a pattern that could be documented and used in court. He communicated almost exclusively face-to-face, in private settings, with only his most trusted associates. He kept his circle small. He met with captains individually rather than in groups. He avoided the telephone entirely, understanding that wiretaps were law enforcement's most effective weapon. When he did speak in public, witnesses later testified that he would cup his hands over his mouth or turn away from potential surveillance points. Aware that lip readers might be employed, he did not allow his name to be used in conversation. Associates referred to him indirectly, if at all. He was meticulous about counter-surveillance, and he ensured that his men were equally careful. Members of the Bonanno family under Massino's leadership were more afraid of their own boss than they were of the FBI. Those who earned well and kept silent were promoted and protected. They received the best rackets, the most profitable territories, and the personal favor of the boss. Those who raised suspicion were dealt with in descending stages of severity. First, a withdrawal of the boss's attention and favor. Then, economic punishment. A man's rackets stripped away, his earning power eliminated. In the Mafia, where a soldier's ability to generate income is the foundation of his status and his livelihood, this was a form of death that stopped just short of the physical, then actual death. Massino was directly involved in or ordered multiple murders during his tenure as boss. The murder of Sonny Black punished the failure that allowed Donnie Brasco inside. The murder of Anthony Mira reinforced the message. The later murder of Gerlando Sciascia eliminated a subordinate who had become too powerful. These were not acts of impulse or passion. They were calculated decisions, planned carefully and executed with the intention of sending a message understood by every member of the organization. The men around Massino operated within these rules not because they believed in some romantic code of honor, but because the alternative was annihilation. Terror produces obedience, but not loyalty. And that difference would eventually destroy everything Massino built. While Massino tightened his grip on the Bonanno family, the FBI struggled to penetrate his organization. Jack Stubing, who headed the Bureau's investigations into the Bonannos, found himself confronting an adversary who seemed to understand law enforcement tactics as well as the agents themselves. Stubbing's team deployed surveillance, wiretaps, and informant cultivation, the standard tools of organized crime investigation. None of them worked. Massino's security protocols neutralized every approach. No one within the organization would speak to the FBI. The fear was too great. Massino's reputation as a man willing to kill anyone who threatened his security preceded every attempt at recruitment. Stubbing later recalled visiting Massino at his legitimate business, a catering company called King Caterers that operated lunch trucks serving construction sites. The trucks, known colloquially as roach coaches, also reportedly served as vehicles for loan sharking and bookmaking. Stubbing engaged Massino in conversation, and what he discovered was unsettling. Massino knew the names of FBI agents assigned to his case. He could physically describe them. He knew what cars they drove. He had partial license plate numbers. He understood every surveillance technique the Bureau had employed against organized crime figures, and he had developed countermeasures for each one. Stubbing left the encounter with a clear understanding. Traditional investigative methods were not going to work against Joe Massino. The financial architecture of Massino's operation reflected the same sophistication as his security protocols. The Bonanno family's income derived from multiple sources, each with its own infrastructure and risks. Narcotics trafficking generated millions. Gambling operations, both bookmaking and illegal casinos, provided steady income. Loan sharking was a core business. Extortion, particularly in the construction and garbage hauling industries, added further revenue. Labor racketeering, which involved infiltrating and controlling unions to extract payments from businesses, was a long-standing enterprise. All of it generated cash that needed to enter the legitimate financial system without attracting attention. One scheme involved the New York State Lottery. Over approximately 5 years, Massino and his wife claimed lottery winnings totaling roughly $500,000. The winnings were not the product of luck. Massino had lottery sellers on his payroll who would identify winning tickets before they were claimed. Massino would purchase the tickets at face value from the winners and then claim the prizes himself, converting illicit cash into apparently legitimate winnings. Another scheme involved parking lots in Manhattan owned by an entrepreneur named Barry Weinberg. By leasing Weinberg's parking operations, Massino could generate false receipts that accounted for large amounts of cash, providing a veneer of legitimacy for drug money and other criminal proceeds. These were not crude operations. They required planning, relationships, and an understanding of how financial systems could be exploited. They also created vulnerabilities. For years, the FBI's inability to penetrate Massino's operation was a source of professional frustration. Here was a man they knew to be running a major criminal organization, and they could not prove it. They could not get anyone to talk. They could not record anything useful. But eventually, the Bureau changed its approach. The catalyst was a decision by Jack Stubing to look for weaknesses not in Massino himself, but in the infrastructure that supported his operations. Massino could control what his men said and where they met. He could not control the paper trail. Money moves through systems. It leaves records, bank deposits, tax filings, business registrations. Every dollar that passes through the legitimate economy creates a document somewhere. Documents do not forget, and they do not refuse to cooperate out of fear. 2 young agents, Jeffrey Saleh and Kimberly McCaffrey, were assigned to follow the money. Both were specialists in forensic accounting, a discipline rarely used against organized crime. They subpoenaed Massino's financial records going back a decade. They examined bank statements, tax returns, credit card records, and corporate filings line by line. The lottery scheme emerged from this analysis. The Weinberg connection emerged from a series of $25,000 checks that appeared repeatedly in Massino's records. When the agents investigated Weinberg, they discovered that despite earning millions annually from his parking lot empire, he was paying almost no taxes. He had evaded approximately $14 million in tax obligations. This gave the FBI leverage. Weinberg was arrested quietly, pulled from his car and placed in a van where Saleh and McCaffrey gave him a choice: cooperate or face prosecution for tax evasion. Weinberg chose to cooperate. Over the following months, he wore a wire and recorded more than 100 incriminating conversations. Those recordings led to racketeering charges against 20 members and associates of the Bonanno family. Among those implicated was Frank Coppa, one of Massino's closest associates, already serving a 5-year sentence for stock fraud. Coppa realized that additional racketeering charges could add 20 years to his imprisonment. He decided to cooperate with the government. Coppa's decision to flip was the first crack in Massino's wall of silence. For years, no one in Massino's organization had been willing to speak to law enforcement. Soldiers and associates understood that cooperation meant death. But fear works only as long as the consequences of speaking are perceived to be worse than the consequences of remaining silent. When a man is facing decades in prison, when his youth and his middle age and his old age will all be spent behind walls, that calculation can shift. And once one person talks, the psychology changes for everyone else. The wall that seemed impenetrable develops a crack, and other men begin to wonder whether they too might find a way through it. Coppa confessed to killing Sonny Black Napolitano, and he confirmed that the murder had been ordered by Joe Massino. It was the first time a cooperating witness had directly connected the boss to a specific homicide. On January 9th, 2003, Saleh and McCaffrey drove to Massino's home to arrest him. They moved quickly, aware that if word of Coppa's cooperation reached the street, Massino might attempt to flee or order the elimination of other potential witnesses. They knocked on the front door. When Massino opened it, he looked at them with the calm of a man who had been expecting this moment and said, "You must be Kimberly. You must be Jeffrey. I have been waiting for you." He knew the names of the agents building the case against him. He had been monitoring their investigation just as they had been monitoring his operations. The difference was that this time, the agents had something his counter-surveillance could not neutralize: a cooperating witness, testimony, and a financial trail that no amount of face-to-face communication could erase. Massino was handcuffed and taken into custody. After an investigation that had evolved from financial forensics into a comprehensive racketeering and murder prosecution, the last Don was finally in chains. With Massino in custody awaiting trial, the FBI continued to build its case, and the most important target for cooperation was Salvatore Vitale, Massino's brother-in-law, his most trusted lieutenant. The man who had run the family during Massino's years in prison knew everything. He knew where the bodies were buried, both figuratively and in several cases literally. He had been involved in orchestrating 11 murders for the family. He could testify to decades of criminal activity, including extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. But Vitale was a lifelong mafioso. He had lived by the code of silence his entire adult life. When Agents Saleh and McCaffrey first approached him, he refused to speak. They told him to look at the 4 walls surrounding him and to understand that this was what he would see for the rest of his life. He said nothing. Then they showed Vitale documentation that Massino had considered having him killed. The relationship between the two men, which had defined the Bonanno family for more than a decade, had been more fragile than anyone on the outside had understood. The suspicion had arisen after Vitale received an unusually light sentence in a bank fraud case connected to a Long Island financial institution that Vitale had essentially converted into his personal collection agency. The lenient sentence made Massino fear that Vitale might have secretly cooperated with the government. Massino had stripped Vitale of his rackets and his earning power, cutting him off from the family's income streams. He had seriously considered having his brother-in-law murdered. The agents told Vitale that his boss had wanted him dead. Vitale asked them to prove it. McCaffrey looked him in the eye and said, "We do not have to prove it to you. You know it is true." Vitale nodded. He said, "Yes, I do know it is true." And with that, Salvatore Vitale, underboss of the Bonanno crime family, brother-in-law and closest confidant of Joe Massino, decided to cooperate. What he told investigators was devastating. He provided detailed testimony regarding 11 murders, along with comprehensive information about the family's criminal operations spanning decades. He listed every crime that he and Massino had been involved in together. The trial of Joe Massino began on May 24, 2004. The charges were staggering: 11 counts of conspiracy, 16 racketeering charges, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, 7 homicides, including the murder of Sonny Black Napolitano. Despite all of Massino's efforts to enforce secrecy, despite the killings and the threats and the elaborate counter-surveillance measures, 7 of his closest associates testified against him. The prosecution's most damaging witness was Vitale. He had been present for or had direct knowledge of virtually every significant criminal act Massino had committed over more than 20 years. The case was, in the words of one prosecutor, airtight. Massino was found guilty on every count. The conviction was a landmark moment in the government's decades-long war against organized crime. But for Massino, the situation was about to become much worse. Even before the verdict was fully processed, he was hit with an additional murder charge. This time, the charge carried the possibility of the death penalty. In 1994, Congress had passed legislation expanding the reach of federal capital punishment. Under this law, a conviction for homicide committed in aid of racketeering could be punished with death. It was a tool designed specifically for cases like Massino's, where murders were committed not as isolated acts of passion, but as calculated business decisions within a criminal enterprise. The new charge related to the 1999 murder of Gerlando Sciascia, a powerful captain who served as the liaison between the Bonanno family's Canadian operations based in Montreal and its New York headquarters. Sciascia had been a valuable and capable leader, but Massino had grown uncomfortable with his independence and his accumulating power. In the zero-sum calculus of mafia leadership, a subordinate who becomes too strong becomes a threat. Massino had Sciascia murdered, his body left on a street in the Bronx. Under the new federal statute, this murder could send Massino to death row. He was the first official boss of a New York Mafia family to face the death penalty. The prospect was real, and the government intended to pursue it. The calculus was now simple and brutal: cooperate or die. And Joe Massino, the man who had killed or ordered the killing of those who broke the code of silence, the man who had built his entire organization on the principle that loyalty to the family was absolute, the man who had punished even the appearance of disloyalty with death, made his choice. He flipped. Acting bosses and street-level soldiers had cooperated with the government before. Sammy the Bull Gravano had turned on John Gotti. Henry Hill had cooperated against the Lucchese family. But no official, sitting boss of one of New York's 5 families had ever agreed to become a government witness. The distinction mattered. An acting boss or an underboss could be dismissed as a subordinate who lacked the character to hold the line. A boss was the man who set the rules, who enforced the code, who demanded silence from everyone beneath him. When the boss himself broke silence, the entire structure collapsed. The code of omerta had been crumbling for years. Valachi in the 60s, Hill in the 80s, Gravano in the 90s. But those men had all been subordinates. Massino was the boss. He had enforced the code with lethal violence, and then he had broken it himself. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Massino pleaded guilty to the murder of Sciascia. He surrendered approximately $10 million in assets, and then he began to talk, not reluctantly, not in fragments. He told investigators everything, every crime he had committed or ordered, every murder, with names, dates, locations, and methods, every financial scheme, every relationship with members of other families, every corrupt official, every compromised business, every hidden asset. He identified fellow mobsters who were still operating. He provided evidence that led to 15 additional indictments against members and associates of the Bonanno family and other organizations. He wore a wire while in prison, recording conversations with other inmates who were themselves organized crime figures, adding yet more evidence to the government's cases. He became, in the words of one former associate, the consummate rat. He gave up everybody to save his own skin. Another described him as the Great Destroyer. He undid everything he had created over 20 years. He had no mercy for anyone else. The consequences of Massino's cooperation extended far beyond the Bonanno family. His testimony provided the government with an unprecedented window into the inner workings of the American Mafia at its highest levels. For decades, prosecutors had relied on lower-ranking cooperators whose knowledge was limited to their own crews and their own captains. Massino was the first boss to provide testimony, and his perspective encompassed the entire organization and its relationships with the other four families. The intelligence he provided reshaped law enforcement's understanding of how the modern mafia operated, how it made money, how it resolved disputes, and how it maintained discipline. When his own life was on the line, the boss had behaved exactly as his soldiers had behaved. He saved himself. The communities affected by the Bonanno family's decades of criminal activity received little benefit from Massino's cooperation. The businesses extorted, paying thousands monthly for the privilege of operating without interference. The construction companies forced to use mob-controlled suppliers and labor, driving up costs passed on to the public. The workers whose unions had been corrupted, their dues siphoned off to enrich men who had never held a legitimate job. The neighborhoods in Queens, Brooklyn, and Long Island flooded with heroin and cocaine, creating waves of addiction that destroyed families for generations. The families of those who had been killed, people whose deaths were ordered with no more consideration than a change in supplier. None of them were made whole. Organized crime does not simply extract money from communities. It distorts entire economies. It corrupts public institutions. And it survives through the acquiescence of people who are not themselves criminals, but who understand that looking the other way is the safest option. Joe Massino's sentence was eventually reduced in recognition of his cooperation. He avoided the death penalty. He avoided life in prison. The man who had ordered the murders of friends, associates, and family members received a degree of leniency that his own victims never experienced. Salvatore Vitale similarly received a reduced sentence. The men who had remained loyal, who had followed the code that Massino himself abandoned, received the harshest punishments. The Bonanno family did not cease to exist after Massino's cooperation. Criminal organizations with decades of institutional infrastructure are not corporations that can be dissolved by a court order. They persist because the conditions that created them persist. New men assumed leadership. New rackets were developed. The family continued to operate, diminished but functional. The mafia had survived every previous assault, from the Kefauver hearings to the commission trials, and each time it had reconstituted itself. The conditions that allowed organized crime to flourish had not changed. Joe Massino was the last of a particular kind of mafia boss. Old school, as former associates described him. He came from a generation that remembered what they considered the glory days, that believed in the rituals and the hierarchy and the traditions brought over from Sicily more than a century ago. He spoke the language of loyalty and honor. He enforced the code of silence with lethal precision. And then, when it was his own life at stake, he abandoned every principle he had ever claimed to hold. He was also the man who did more damage to the American Mafia than any law enforcement operation in history, not through any noble intention, but through the simple logic of self-preservation. He built an empire on silence, and then he destroyed it by talking. The 15 indictments that resulted from his cooperation, the intelligence he provided about the workings of all 5 families, the precedent he set by becoming the first boss to cooperate. These consequences rippled outward through the entire structure of organized crime in America. If the boss could flip, then the last psychological barrier to cooperation was gone. In the end, the mafia did not destroy Joe Massino. Joe Massino destroyed the mafia. And he did it for the oldest, simplest, most human reason of all. He wanted to live.